Good morning and welcome on this beautiful morning of Chicago. Our guest speaker today is Professor Margarita Mooney, Associate Research Scientist, Sociology, Yale University, and the author of the book, Faith Makes Us Live, Surviving and Thriving in the Haitian Diaspora. In July 2013, Margarita Mooney joined the Department of Sociology at Yale University as an Associate Research Scientist. She received her MA and PhD in Sociology from Princeton University and her BA in Psychology from Yale University. From 2007 until 2013, she was an assistant professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina. Her areas of interest include religion, immigration, theory, and culture. Her book, Faith Makes Us Live, Surviving and Thriving in the Haitian Diaspora, was published by University of California Press in 2009. Our second guest speaker is Professor Michel Andraos, the Associate Professor, Intercultural Studies and Ministry, Catholic Theological Union. Professor Michel Andraos, a native of Lebanon and a citizen of Canada, has studied, worked, and lived in 6 different countries. He holds the following degrees: STL, Pontifical Oriental Institute of Rome, DEA, University of Strasbourg, France, PhD, University of St. Michael's College, Toronto. His diverse theological background and extensive intercultural exposure enable him to help students dialogue across cultural boundaries. His area of research include theology, religion, violence, and peace, Christian theology of religion, pluralism, and the church and native people in the Americas. The focus of his current research is on the relation between the Christian communities in the Levant and Western Christianity during the colonial period. Welcome, professors.
Good morning. Just one second while I open up my talk. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold, so hopefully I won't be clearing my throat the entire morning. Thank you. It's a really great pleasure to be back at DePaul for the World Catholicism Conference. I actually spoke here excuse me, a couple of years ago and really enjoyed the experience. So it's a great pleasure to be back. And what I would like to do today, I'm going to spend the first few minutes summarizing the main findings of my book, Faith Makes Us Live, Surviving and Thriving in the Haitian Diaspora. But the real objective of my talk today is to use this project that I did on Haitian migrants to frame my new research project, which is actually on, young adults and resilience. I've spent the last year interviewing young adults all across the country who've had some sort of traumatic life event. And so what I'm going to do today is compare what I found with young adults in the US to what I saw in the Haitian community. So I wanted to just put up a picture. This is a picture I took from Notre Dame de Haiti Catholic Church in Miami, where I spent about 7 months doing field work. And to be honest, this story tells you a little bit about my field of sociology and where I was coming from. I chose to do my work in this parish because I was really interested in immigrant assimilation, defined as socioeconomic achievement. And so I wanted to study Haitians in Miami because they're such a large immigrant group, and I wanted to compare them in Miami and Montreal and Paris. But my focus really, when I started, was on how the church helps immigrants in their social, economic, and political struggles. So when I started doing field work in this parish, that's what I was trying to find out. But what really struck me was, honestly, people's really strong narratives about their suffering as transformative. This is something I had never encountered in sociology, and it's not what I was initially looking for. I was initially trying to find out sort of what types of social networks migrants got through their churches, how they got legal papers, how they found healthcare, things that my field of sociology thinks, excuse me, are the most important goods of the human life. Goodness, thank you. Oh, that might help very much. Thank you, sister. Probably should have done this earlier. So, to follow on what I started off saying, what I'm going to actually do today is use my book, Faith Makes Us Live, to help to show you how I think about young adults and resilience, and to raise some questions about American culture. And specifically what I'm going to argue today is that I think that the experiences of migrants like Haitians can shed light on several contemporary aspects of US culture that we may not sometimes even notice. So one thing I'm going to show you through the narratives that I'll present from young adults is that I actually think the United States has a very culturally impoverished narrative of suffering as something to be numbed. The second thing I'm going to show is that really what I found in my current work is that a lot of young adults lack the community structures that would help them overcome their traumatic life experience. So in contrast to Haitians who have extremely strong communities and social ties, I interviewed many young adults who have no meaningful community to speak of whatsoever. And third, what I have found in my interviews and my work with young adults is that they really lack any kind of transcendent, grand narrative that would link their individual identity to a greater sense of belonging beyond their own heads or perhaps their own closest relationships. So let me just give you some example. Let me just tell you briefly what I did and then give you 4 examples. One of the critiques on my book on Haitians was, well, everybody's narrative sounds really the same. And when you interview a bunch of people who all belong to the same community, in some ways that's not that surprising, right? So I found very similar narratives of suffering as transformative, whether I was in Miami, Montreal, or Paris. And I ended my book, Faith Makes Us Live, with questions about second-generation Haitians. To what extent will the importance of religious faith be passed on from the immigrant generation to their children? And this actually was the Haitian parents' biggest concern. They would look at US society, or Canada or France for that matter, and they were really worried about the disintegration of social bonds, about the high rates of drug abuse, about people not taking education seriously. So I finished my book with this very hopeful story about first-generation Haitians, but with a lot of questions about what's going to happen to the second generation as they acculturate to some of the more negative sides of culture in the US. And one of the critiques I kept getting from my book was, well, what happens to people who are not very much involved with religion? How do they deal with traumatic life events? So I had this bright idea that ended up working, but it was very challenging. I had this bright idea to work with people doing a national survey of young adults and pick those young adults from this national survey of 3,000 young adults, and I picked those who had the highest levels of trauma. And I went out and I interviewed them wherever they were. It ended up being 26 different communities in 10 different states and 3 different parts of the US. So I spent a lot of time on plane, driving, etc. to find these young adults. And what I found is what I'm going to summarize now. I'm going to talk to you about 4 young adults that I met and sort of what their stories tell us about American culture, and then tie this back to an argument that I think we don't hear enough of of, which is what are some of the cultural riches that migrants bring to the US. Again, mostly in my field of sociology, questions about migration are always framed from a question of deficits. What don't migrants have? What do they need? How can we help them? Rather than flipping it around a little bit. So let me tell you about one woman that I met named Laura. Laura's life story is a long narrative of pain. She was bullied for being obese as a child, and then became pregnant at age 15 and dropped out of high school. The child she bore brought her happiness she had never before known. Until one day, she got a phone call at work telling her to rush home. Her little baby had climbed out of the kitchen door and fallen into a pond in the backyard. Police and paramedics surrounded her house, and her baby was clinging to life. Laura prayed incessantly to God to save her baby's life, even if her baby would end up brain damaged. But when her baby died a couple of hours later, even the doctors cried and asked why. She told me that she felt like in that moment she was in the dark and there was no light at the end of the tunnel. When she told me this story, I shivered. Laura has experienced darkness so profound that most of us hope and pray we never ever end up in her situation. Laura never had close relationships growing up, and her baby's death tore even deeper into her weak relationship with her mother, her father, her brother, and the baby's father. When I met Laura 5 years after her baby had died, she had had 2 more children, one with the same father, one with a different father. Although her deceased baby's father started abusing her and started taking drugs and alcohol, Laura still lives with him. But she fears him most of the time, and so started doing Wicca to expel the demons that talk to her while her boyfriend is sleeping. Laura definitely believes in some kind of higher power. The problem is that higher power isn't 100% there, she said. So, for example, when Laura's boyfriend took her with him to buy drugs, Laura asked God to keep her safe, and God protected her. But when her baby was dying, God didn't show up to help her. And the memory of God abandoning her at her darkest moment haunts her. To ease her emotional pain and calm her nerves and not cry all day, Laura used to smoke marijuana 3 times a day. She was recently arrested for drug possession, and so she's now stopped smoking marijuana, but instead she takes 4 mental health medications to calm her nerves, to balance out her moods, to help her sleep. When I met her at a coffee shop in the South, her voice was very quiet, her diction was slurred, and her eyes were glassed over. "She's not all there," I scribbled in my notes. I could feel in my own body that Laura's pain was so deep, and her medication was so heavy, that her full self was buried somewhere. Laura works at a full-time, low-wage job, and she really talks about her hopes for her future, focusing on her children. "I'm stuck," Laura said, but she really believes that she can help her children avoid the same pain that she had. Sometimes when her children see her crying, they look at her and say, "Mommy, you okay?" Her voice shook when she looked at me and told me that she replies, "Mommy loves you forever, no matter what." For the sake of her kids, Laura wants to get on track and do good. She prays there will be a finish line to her pain. After the interview was over, I leaned over on Laura's small frame, hugged her tightly, and blabbered like 5 times, "I'm really sorry for your pain, and I do hope there is a finish line soon." So, before I move on, I want to raise a couple of questions. What does Laura's narrative say about our broader culture? And, oops, that's the wrong button. Here we go. So, what I found in this narrative with Laura, and with many other people who I interviewed, she's asking some really deep questions. Is there ever going to be a finish line to my pain, for example? But in asking those questions about meaning and purpose, she's encountering this kind of grand American narrative that's very utilitarian and individualistic. So even though she's asking these big ontological questions, she's struggling so much with so much weight of her suffering that her initial response to that suffering was to numb her own feelings by taking substances. And I heard this again and again in many young adults' own words, sort of they're looking back on their life of drugs and alcohol as a way of easing this emotional pain. So what I found with Laura was that she lacked this sense of suffering as potentially transformative. She's just stuck in this context that's very negative, that's holding her down, and she's somehow just trying to get by one step at a time. So what I've started to do with this research is, because I found very few young adults who are religious in any traditional way, I've been framing people's narratives around sort of religion as a quest for meaning. And I'm getting a lot of this from a psychologist named Kenneth Pargament, who's done a lot of work on religion and resilience amongst older adults. And a lot of times we forget that people's experiences of suffering are bringing up these larger questions about what is the meaning of my life and what is the purpose. But what I found is that so many young adults are asking these questions, but have very few narratives to draw on. Another way that Kenneth Pargament says that religion helps people cope with traumatic life events, and I certainly saw this in the Haitian community, is by promoting strong social connections. But in the context of young adult religion in the United States today, there are many young adults who want to practice their faith on their own and don't necessarily feel a need to have an institutional religion. In fact, one young adult who I interviewed, I don't know if many of you have read Robert Bella's book, Habits of the Heart, where he talks about individualism, and he describes one woman who talks about her faith as Sheilaism, that she basically relies on herself and it's all on her own. I actually had a young adult tell me that she was raised Christian, but now she just believes in herself, Bethanyism. So this individualist view of religion also struck me as a difficult situation for many young adults. So let me tell you about one other woman named Sherry. She was one of the people who on the survey that I was using had chosen no specific religious affiliation, but she did say on the survey that she believed in God. When I met her in a pretty affluent neighborhood out west, she was wearing bright colored pants and a cheerful smile. But I quickly learned that the traumas in Sherry's life were related to a very serious heart condition that she had called supraventricular tachycardia. And she had a very severe condition of it, which actually led her to have 3 heart surgeries before she turned 15. And so she was, from the age of 9 to 15, she was rushed to the emergency room twice a week to have her heart restarted. So she died and was brought back to life twice a week for years. So she called herself a pretty morbid child who thought she was going to die at any moment, not surprisingly. She even had out-of-body experiences every time she died, and she described these to me. Very interesting. My eyes were really bulging as Sherry described how much she had suffered. And she also really described how her suffering cut her off from her peers. She had very few friends growing up because she was always so sick. She had learned to cover up her inner pain with a cheerful smile and lighthearted laughter, as she actually described many of her traumas. She was a high school cheerleader, she got straight A's, and is now very successful at work. But Sherry has refused to let herself grow close to anybody emotionally. To illustrate her problems with intimacy, she bluntly told me that she cold-heartedly dumped the first guy who fell in love with her. He was the first guy she ever had sex with, and she couldn't stand that he wanted to look at her in the eyes and touch her face while they made love. So she cheated on him by having casual sex with another guy who did not want intimacy. She felt really cold and detached when she broke the heart of the guy who loved her and wanted to marry her. And she told me, I have a sick mind with regards to sex and intimacy. She was raised Lutheran and used to go to church every week with her family. But when she was going through confirmation classes, she began to doubt if Jesus was really God. She got kicked out of her Lutheran confirmation classes because she said that she felt comfortable praying to God, but this Jesus guy, I think he was just a man. Her mother, who was Catholic, told Sherry she was an atheist because she doesn't believe Jesus is God. But Sherry kept telling me, I really, really do believe in God. I just don't know if Jesus is my homeboy. So looking back on her traumas, I wanted to know if Sherry had prayed to God during all of those near-death experiences. She had previously told me that she had once attempted suicide by taking pills. But when I asked her if she ever prayed to God during her many heart failures, her voice slowed and she told me that she had had a very memorable moment when another time, she had tried to kill herself, but with razor blades this time. She had a wondering look in her eyes, and when she explained, I was kind of questioning things in general, and I just felt so alone, and I didn't feel like anybody understood me. So I was going to do it. I was really going to do it. I was going to do it. I was so depressed. Her voice became very emphatic as she repeated, I was just so hysterical, so hysterical. I was going to do it, like I had the razor blade in my hand. But it wasn't just the fact that she tried to commit suicide that got Sherry tongue-tied. Her speech patterns, which were full of these words like and kinda, she groped to sort of explain this experience to me. She was really struggling to describe this powerful supernatural experience that she had on the cold bathroom floor as she was sobbing uncontrollably and was preparing to end her life. She said, I was crying, and I remember I just had kind of something on my shoulder like, you're okay, don't do it, like it's gonna be okay, and she laughs. Her laughter indicated sort of her own incredulity and her own difficulty in speaking about what had happened to her. I didn't interrupt her because I wanted to hear her describe this own experience, even if her words were kind of rambling. So she continued and she said, like I just felt this weird calm and I was just like, whoa, I think that's God. And she laughed again. Like I remember thinking like I just couldn't explain what it was, but I just felt like this calm sensation and I just decided not to do it. And I was just like, oh, that's weird. It was so instant, I just like, I don't know. Given her earlier revelations that she struggles with intimacy, her statements about this memorable moment really struck me. This event, she told me, this event just always kind of impacted the way I thought. Like, I've just never really felt alone since then. So, when Sherry paused finally in this dramatic story, I asked her to sort of tell me about how these struggles had experienced her faith and how this experience of God saving her from committing suicide had influenced her faith. And Sherry told me that she's read lots of books about Christianity and even about Buddhism, but she just can't find a religion that matches her experiences with God. So she doesn't understand exactly what happened to her on that bathroom floor, and she's not even sure she's meant to understand it, and that's okay with her. So I asked, since God helped her, saved her life, does she pray to God now for her, relief from her suffering? And she actually told me that she doesn't. And she doesn't attend church because she finds that most of the evangelical megachurches that her friends go to are very culty. And she really doesn't like asking a pastor for help, and she doesn't want to pray to Jesus for help either. So she does go out on these long walks and try to connect to God on her own and sort of stimulate this presence inside of her that she felt that night. And she used to take antidepressants during her teen years, but she felt very numb and felt like she didn't have a normal range of emotions, so she's now gotten off antidepressants. And when she feels down, she tries to find this presence. She's never attempted suicide again, but she's also never had a real intimate relationship with anybody. And this is what she describes as the most difficult part of her life, her inability to have any kind of intimacy. But what was also interesting about this is that she doesn't pray for herself. But when I asked her to tell me about her family, she told me all this stuff about her trauma and nearly dying and all of her intimacy. She was actually kind of laughing half the time, sort of laughing at how incredible her story was. And I was kind of crying listening to this sad story. When I asked her to talk about her family, it was the only time that she actually cried. And she told me that her brother, she has been estranged from for about 15 years because he ran away from home, became homeless, and is now institutionalized with a mental illness. And she described him as a lost soul. And so she looked at me, without me even asking, she looked at me and she says, you know, I don't pray for myself, but I do ask God to help my brother. I thought this was extremely interesting, that she's unable to reach out to God in her own suffering, but will do it for her brother. So what does Sherry, Sherry ended her interview, she's actually doing really well at work, she makes a lot of money, she just bought a home, she's got a fancy car. But she told me the last thing that she said in the interview was that her greatest hope is to be able to develop intimate relationships because she wants to be, quote, a functioning human being, a member of society. So what does Sherry's narrative tell us? Well, I think two things. As I mentioned, this idea that religion helps with resilience through social connection, I think is very true, but most of the young adults that I interviewed had very weak ties to any kind of institutional religion. And I think you see this in Sherry. But oftentimes, again, mostly in my field of sociology, this sort of declining adherence or lack of young adults attending church or people moving away from claiming a specific denomination is oftentimes interpreted as some sort of lack of interest in God. And this is not what I'm finding. People are still asking these big questions, but they're asking them sort of on their own. So Sherry still has this idea that God is good and that God takes care of her, and even that God saved her life, right? That God kept her from committing suicide. So she believes in God's goodness and she seeks him out, but she's doing it completely outside of any kind of tradition. And so this raises the question for me, well, what does this actually mean for her long term? She's connecting to God on her own, one-on-one, but she's really not connecting with anybody else. And so this is, I think, a shortcoming in how she's handling her trauma. Okay. Alex is an African-American man I met in a small town in the South. He was very eager to talk to me, and he was very eager to tell me about his great love with his girlfriend and his faith in God. But his stories about his optimism for his future was punctuated by stories of past drug use that led him to actually overdose 2 times and be brought back to life. He also told me he has a criminal record about this big, and starting at age 10, he was diagnosed with a pretty long list of mental illnesses: ADD, ADHD, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. And he constantly lamented the lack of a sturdy foundation at his home for why he became such a hellraiser. He never knew the identity of his father, and he adores his grandmother, but he stole from her to support his drug habit. He's always lived with his mother, but when I asked him about his brother, he told me that his brother never talked to him again after he chased him around the house with a giant butcher knife and tried to kill him. So this love that Alex talked about that he feels from God and from his girlfriend and even from his grandmother who has forgiven him, contrasted with everybody else he spoke about, but especially his mother. His mother told him so many times that she wished he was dead that one day Alex actually went and got a .38 special from his uncle's house and took out the ammo, but walked into the kitchen and put the gun to his head in front of his mother and said he was going to kill himself. And his mother said, "Please, go ahead and do it. I have a cake right here, and I can't wait for you to do it. I'm going to invite the entire neighborhood over to have a party. Please kill yourself." So I looked at him, and I asked him this question. I said, how did that make you feel? And he said to me in his southern accent, "Pardon me, ma'am, but it felt like pure S-H-I-T." I really sank down in my seat as Alex's speech slowed. His eyes wandered up to the ceiling, and he pondered his painful relationship with his mother, exemplified by her asking him, begging him to commit suicide. So, what turned Alex's life around? After about 10 years of heavy substance abuse and constant trouble with the police and himself overdosing twice, Alex really reached a turning point when his friend overdosed in his arms and died. Alex is now substance-free. He's even stopped taking mental health medications, and he's also stopped taking pain pills, which he used to abuse as well. And apparently he has none of his previous symptoms of mental illness. So he wants to enroll in community college, get a stable job, marry his girlfriend, and raise a family to be proud of him. So Alex has really turned from a troubled life to a more normal one. But I finished this interview with some questions about Alex. Will his future really look as positive as he thinks it will? He told me multiple times, he said, he's lucky he's not in the ground, underground really, or locked away somewhere for the rest of my life. He's recently gone back to the Baptist faith he was raised in, and he really believes God will turn his life around, but things are moving slowly. Alex's life has begun to change in part because he's now started kind of interpreting small events as God working in his life. So when I asked him to sort of tell me how God works in his life, he said really simple things. Like one day he was feeling really down and he walked into a friend's house, and his friend's little sister, 7-year-old, had a teddy bear in her arms and just looked at him and said, Alex, everything's gonna be okay. And he interpreted that comment from this little girl as God speaking to him and God comforting him. So he told me a lot of these little stories that he knows God is working in his life because he started to see sort of the significance of God working in all these small ways. But I was confused about whether or not Alex really has given up substance abuse. If I asked him if he drank, and he drank recently, and in fact he had finished off a case of beer with a friend the previous night. And he had pretty bloodshot eyes when I was interviewing him. And I really also wondered whether his intense romantic love with his girlfriend will actually continue into a stable marriage. So what does Alex's narrative tell us? Kenneth Pargament has written on this, and this is also what I saw in my interviews. People who turn to religion to help them with their trauma normally were raised in some sort of religious context. I interviewed many young adults who were raised in atheist households, and by no means did I see them turning to religion to help them understand their trauma, right? So religion helps with trauma, helps cope with negative events, but only if it's actually part of someone's personal biography, right? So Alex would draw on his earlier life being raised in the Baptist church and kind of going back to it. But this idea that people who are not religious at all have these dramatic conversions to Christianity or another faith to cope with trauma doesn't actually happen very often. I found one person for whom, the one person for whom I found that was the case, she herself had also been raised in a Christian household and then left it and then returned. So the issue that I'm raising here sort of is that what's going to happen with people who continue to have traumatic life events but for whom religious narratives and practices were never part of their background? What will they turn to? And I actually just didn't find that much else that people were turning to. The other thing that I mentioned with Alex's narrative that I pointed out is that really, I think another way that religion helps people cope with trauma, as I mentioned, is by helping people see small events as having big significance, right? So turning these kind of little moments into a way of seeing God's hand working. Okay, the last example, and then I'm going to sort of wrap up with getting back to the Haitian migrants. I met a woman named Monica in the South, and the first thing she told me when I asked her about her family, the first thing she said was, my father was a cheating butthead, to put it nicely. After her father, when she was a child, her father spent 5 years in jail for having sex with one of his students at school, and he became a Christian while in jail, but got out of jail and then continued to cheat on Monica's mother and eventually moved in with his female boss. So amongst other things, Monica thanks her father for teaching her that there are a lot of fake Christians and telling her exactly what not to do in marriage. So Monica herself wavered from her Baptist faith that she was raised in, especially when she got into partying a lot with, at a local state university. And she eventually failed out of school for drinking too much and getting bad grades. But she moved back home and met her devout evangelical husband while she was working at a local grocery store. And so she now joined a Reformed Baptist congregation with her husband. And she was the only person out of anybody that I interviewed who could give a specific reason why they belonged to a denomination. She was the only person who had a strong identity with any Christian denomination, and she could actually really explain it, that the Reformed Baptist, according to her, traced her roots back to the 1689 Baptist Confession of London. And she was very articulate at telling me how her Baptist group is very different from Southern Baptist. So she says, that she really had gone the way of the world and even went a little crazy during college, but she's now returned to her faith through the influence of her husband and holds on to her faith as the truth and the way and the life. She spends about 4 or 5 nights a week at church, either doing a Bible study or leading a youth group or studying theology. And she talks about her church as her family. So when her husband's parents were killed in a tragic accident, her family felt the loss that they felt, and they really helped her. So she talked very eloquently about how being close to Christ helps her handle suffering, both in her own life, but also in her work as a nurse in the emergency room. So Monica had a very eloquent story about praying all day long, praying for patients, praying for the people she's trying to help, that they may have healing. And she really used the word thankful about 25 times in her interview. She was extremely thankful to God for many, many things in her life. Although she lamented having such a narcissistic father, she's very close to her mother and to her other siblings. So Monica really stood out for how strongly embedded she was in her faith and how her relationship with God was the most important thing to her. And so what I think we see kind of from Monica's narrative is both that the power of religious communities to provide these strong social connections, but also in the case of Monica, that now that she's returned to her Baptist faith, she reinterprets all of the suffering of her past life as a path towards God, as finding God's providence even in all of these negative things. So she was the one who sounded the most like the Haitians that I had interviewed in looking on their trauma and their suffering as not a good in and of itself, but a way to draw themselves closer to God and ultimately to be able to help other people. But I want to point out that she really was an exception in my study. She was the only person, one of maybe 2 or 3, who had a strong personal faith, a daily practice of prayer, who belonged to a community, and who understood sort of the reasons behind her faith. Most of the other young adults that I talked to sounded somewhere more like Sherry or Laura. They're kind of interested in the supernatural, or they're aware of the supernatural, but they pick and choose from different elements, and in some cases, even kind of combining ideas about Wicca with ideas of a Christian God who's provident, with believing in God but not believing in Jesus, with praying for other people but I won't pray for myself. I heard this again and again, and as I mentioned, I even heard someone describe her faith as being about herself. Bethanyism, she called it. So Monica was truly an exception. And so I finished this study, I finished these interviews, having started them trying to understand resilience. And I did learn about resilience, but I think what I learned more was how much suffering in the United States can lead to chronic dysfunction and all kinds of addictions. And so I'm still trying to make sense of everything that I found. And as I've begun to present these findings, people have asked me, well, how does this compare to the Haitian migrants that you studied? So to just bring back for a moment to the Haitian community of Miami, I took this picture in Notre Dame right after the Haitian earthquake. So what you see there is a mural that was in the Haitian church, and then next to it is a picture from a destroyed church in Port-au-Prince right after the earthquake. But you can see this cross that survived the earthquake. And it's probably hard to see from here, but right to the right of the cross, there's this image that looks like the Virgin Mary, right? So the Haitian community in Miami and also in Montreal and also in Paris had this real strong theology of grace and hope and this grand narrative of suffering. That's something that's not necessarily a good thing, but can transform individuals' lives and can bring new life, right? So Haitians talked about suffering as something that pierces your heart. It hurts, but it allows you to go closer to God, and it allows you to see people in a more pure light and be able to love people more deeply. So I was really struck during my work with the Haitian community about their strong narratives around suffering. And this was so absent from the young adults in the United States who I've interviewed. So I just wanted to end by kind of you know, I'm sure all of us here have been reading what Pope Francis has been writing, and I think the image of what he's said that sticks with me the most is this phrase of the church as a battlefield for the wounded. And I think these young adults that I've interviewed are exactly what he's talking about. It is a battlefield out there. People with relational hurts, with parents who are either absent or I wish that they were dead. Massive amounts of substance abuse. I have data on that if you're curious about how much substance abuse there is with young adults. It's much higher than I myself realized. And I began to wonder, what are we actually doing as a people or as a church for these young adults? And I think that we can learn from migrants. And so sort of what I found is that Haitian migrants in their communities are really strong examples of communities of resilience in a really therapeutic and individualistic society. Resilience is often phrased as kind of a psychological trait or something, you know, you can just cope and come back with. It's framed as an individual thing, but nobody gets unstuck by themselves. And Haitians know this very well. Americans tend to hold on to this kind of pull yourself up from your bootstraps, I can do this by myself narrative. And so I think that Haitian migrants actually, their transformative view of suffering sheds light on this culturally impoverished view of suffering we have in the US as something to be numbed. And the last point that I'll make is that I think, again, from my field of sociology, we tend to talk about migration and try to find a political solution or an economic solution. But my argument is that human persons really also need a moral platform from which they can reach the transcendent and build communities of belonging. So when we even talk about migration and diaspora, just to try to bring this kind of sense of the importance of community and belonging, and using that, I think, as a way to critique a little bit of what I'm not seeing happening in American culture. Okay, thank you.
Now is our second guest speaker, Professor Michel, and after his talk, we can start receiving the questions.
Thank you. Good morning. I really enjoyed listening to Professor Mooney's presentation, and the way she ended, I thought connects nicely with a part of my presentation, which is, the title is Levantine Catholic Communities in the Diaspora at the Intersection of Many Worlds. And the bigger framework is Cultures of Diaspora, focusing mostly on the Catholic communities. This is not really my main area of research, but being a Levantine Christian myself, and I'll explain in a minute what I mean by the word Levantine, because that's not normally a used term. People often hear about Middle Eastern Christians or sometimes Near East, but I'm intentionally using this word, and I would say what I mean by this in a minute. So I've been studying this topic for a long period of time, but it's somehow on the back burner. And I really welcome the opportunity of this conference to sort of work on it for some time and deepen my research and articulate my thought on this topic. Myself, I am an immigrant from Lebanon. I have been out of the country for I have to count sometimes, I forget the numbers, but more than 25 years for sure. And I've been in North America between Canada and the US for the last 20 years plus. And recently, I mean for the last 12 years teaching at Theological in Chicago. So in a way, I'm not telling my personal story, but in a way, in the background of what I'm saying is also a lot of the experience of my experience and the experience of my family as Catholics from the Middle East who belong to different communities, and the question of how to make sense of our cultures and religious tradition in the new culture in diaspora. So Levantine Catholic communities in the diaspora, like many other immigrant communities from traditional societies, face the challenge of maintaining their religious and cultural identities and traditions, as well as interpreting these traditions in a meaningful way to the second generation in new cultural contexts. The cultural challenge these communities or our communities face in this process are the main topic of my presentation. I will do this in two parts. The first part is to give a quick overview of what are these communities I'm talking about, their size, their geographical distribution. And the second part will focus more on the question of the cultural identity and how is this identity negotiated. Why the word Levant in the title instead of the Middle East or Near East, which mostly take a political meaning in the present? Levant refers to the eastern part of the Mediterranean. The people of that region experienced a shared culture and internal migration for several thousand years. Ecclesially, most of the region, especially the coastal area, was influenced by the Church of Antioch, and most of the churches as patriarchates all have the name as a patriarchates of Antioch and the East, whether it's Melkite or Maronite or Coptic, or not Coptic, but many of the churches of the East are referred to the belonging to Antioch. Antioch was the meeting place and the base tradition for these communities, which was known broadly to be an ecclesial culture where many worlds met between the Byzantine and the Syriac, and where there was openness to Islam later and the interaction with Islam. All this really happened within the boundaries of this Antiochian church. Today, the region includes the countries of Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, and Lebanon. The island of Cyprus could also be counted as part of the region. Like the terms Middle East and Near East, Levant is also a European designation because it refers to the lands from where the sun rises. This is a word, Levant, Levant. I like to use Levantine more than other designations, Middle East and Near East, because it's being used more often now by the Christian communities in the region to describe their shared identity. As in Arabic we say, Al-Masihiyun al-Mashriqiyun, means the Christians of the East. And as it's emerging as a common identity of the people from the different small churches and patriarchates. So in my presentation, I will use all three terms back and forth. However, I'm intentional about using the word Levantine because of what it carries as a meaning now in terms of an emerging movement. So quick overview of these communities. The names of the communities in discussion as the Catholic Levantine communities in diaspora are the Maronite, that are represented by Father Pierre today, the chair of our panel, who is the pastor of the Maronite Church in Chicago. And before that, he was the pastor in the Maronite Church in Los Angeles for many years, and he represents that church and tradition. So we have the Maronites, the Melkite, which is the Byzantine Catholic or Greek Catholic church, and that's part of the Eastern Greek Orthodox Church that became Catholic in the 18th century. And the Syriac Catholic Church, not the Syrian, but Syriac, referring to the rite and the liturgical family. We have the Armenian Catholic, the Chaldean, and the Latin rite, which for Westerners is the Roman Catholic. Now, Roman Catholic in our languages is confusing because Roman Catholic is the Melkite. Rome are the Greeks or the Roman Empire, and those who became Catholic and from the empire are Roman Catholic, but actually in Arabic it's the Melkites, and in the Western language it's the Roman as part. So confusing words. Now, if you notice, there is word Catholic after each name of these communities, except for the Maronite Church, and the reason is because all these communities became Catholic, mostly within the 18th and 19th centuries. So, essentially, over a period of time as a result of encounter with Western missionaries and in the context of the collapsing Ottoman Empire and the expanding power of Europe, colonial power of Europe, including the power of the Catholic Church and the missionary schools and initiatives. So, and we add to these communities the Coptic Catholic Church, which makes the full group. But that's not totally included in my thinking about the Levantine churches, because it really becomes more like a North African church that's more connected to the Ethiopian and Church of Sudan and the different rites than the Syriac mostly and Byzantine families of the Levant. So the total number of these communities in the Middle East, the whole Middle East, not only in the Levant and beyond, Catholic and Orthodox Christians are only, that's including Egypt, are only within the range of 17 million people. So we're not talking about a huge number of population divided into many, many countries. The churches in communion with Rome are less than 1/3 of that number. And if we take out the Copts, which are the majority among the Levantine Catholics, what remains really in the Levant is we're less than with 3 million people. There are more members of these communities of these churches in the diaspora than there is actually in the Levant at the present moment, because of the migration over the last century. In North America, there is roughly about 1 million people affiliated to the 7 Eastern Catholic churches mentioned above. Exact numbers are very difficult to find, since there is no official census that gives such information. My information is basically from the websites of these communities. So I roughly added the numbers from different websites and divided this by 2 to get the exact number, because I think our communities tend to be generous in counting their numbers. And since it's so difficult, this is a Levantine cultural custom to be generosity, and we use it with numbers as well. It's hard to tell really in any parish how big the parish is. Numbers could vary from 100,000 to 200,000, or I mean the difference is really vast. So members of these communities mostly live in the large cities in North America, such as most big immigrants arrive to the East Coast cities first, and then moved to the hinterlands. So most in cities like Boston, New York area, Detroit area, Chicago, of course, St. Louis, Los Angeles now has a big community, and it actually has become the seat of the Maronite Church in the US. And in Canada, we have the cities of Toronto and Montreal, and then Halifax, Edmonton, with smaller communities. They have, the Eastern Rite churches have organized dioceses in Canada and the US, and sometimes you have 2 bishops. One, normally in Canada, it's in Montreal, the Melkites and the Maronites. In the US, it could vary between Boston or Los Angeles now, or Detroit, or the big metropolitan areas. The evangelicals and Orthodox migrants from the Levant have a different connection, because they both come. One is the evangelical churches are more recent, and they identify with the Presbyterians and Lutherans in North America, so they connect with these communities and become part of them. They don't have their distinct Middle Eastern. Sometimes you might have Arabic-speaking Baptist church, or Arabic-speaking some evangelical or Pentecostal church, but for the most part, the evangelicals, Protestants, and also the Orthodox belong to the larger Orthodox communion in the US, which is substantially bigger than the Catholic communities. So early waves of migration from the Levant to North America started in the late 19th century. Already in the 1880s, there were Levantine communities and churches in Montreal and Toronto. The Melkite Church St. John the Baptist in Chicago and North Lake a few years ago celebrated its 100th anniversary. So these communities had established churches now in North America for over a century. The same can be for the eastern cities of the East Coast in the US. Newer waves during of immigration during the two world wars, of course, affected the region very heavily, and so people kept coming from. The reason of the migration in the late 19th century is because of the collapsing Ottoman Empire and the pressure on the empire, and this led to waves of persecution. And there were several massacres and confrontations between religious communities. That's a long history to explain why these massacres happened, and the quick answer people give, especially in the north, that Christians have always been persecuted in the Middle East. That's really totally incorrect, neither historically nor as a fact. So these massacres did happen, of course, and many hundreds of, tens of thousands of people killed in the Levant in the middle of the 19th century, which created an atmosphere of fear. But this was due to shifting social relations and power of the communities in the region. However, this is a much bigger topic and deserves a different talk. But just to say that there is a sense of a fear that these communities came with from the very beginning of the migration in the late 19th century and also the 20th century to the present moment. There are new waves of migration that happened from the 70s of last century, and this is because of the recent round of conflicts, beginning with the Arab-Israeli war in '67, and then later the Lebanese war that started in '75 to 1990. A big number, more than a third of the Lebanese people, and many of them were among the Christians, left the country in the early parts of the war, and then not only Christians who left, but also the Muslims. From the middle of last century, the migration from the region is actually, there are more Muslims leaving than Christians in terms of numbers, but this becomes, in terms of percentage, because of the smaller number of the Christian communities, this becomes higher percentage in the Christian communities, but in terms of numbers, it's mostly, that's to say that the situation that pushing Christians to migrate is the same that's pushing other communities to migrate, and that's not specifically a Christian phenomenon. So while there are several scholarly studies on the contemporary Christian communities in the Middle East, especially in the last 10 years, there is a phenomenal number of historical studies on Christianity, the formation of the communities and their identities in the 19th century as a result of the encounter with Western Christianity, and how this really reshaped and in most cases recreated these communities with a total new identity. There is very little done on these communities in Diaspora, and I really found it hard to find articles on that help do some kind of a cultural analysis. And there are dispersed articles here and there done on small communities, but there is no studies that I can refer to have a sense of what is happening in the culture of these communities in Diaspora. I'm not, unlike Professor Mooney, I'm not a sociologist. I don't intend to, in the remainder of this presentation, I don't intend to do a study on the integration and assimilation of these communities in the new societies. But I would like to focus on the cultural, give a cultural and a pastoral overview based on my own experience, observations and research, and identify some of the challenges our communities are facing, focusing mainly on their present reality. I conclude by sharing a few theological, pastoral insights that reflect how I think about the future of these communities in North America. Okay, so the question of identity of these communities, it's a very complex question, identity, especially when we have multiple layers of immigration and ongoing people joining these communities. Identity is a complex topic. It's of course socially constructed and dynamic. People everywhere, especially in the big cities of the world, as a result of migration and cultural diversity, constantly need to reconstruct their identities, both individually and collectively. The need for self-understanding, who we are in relation to other people in a given society, is a basic human cultural need, and identity is an important part of culture. Like culture, identity, collective and individual, is deeply challenged when people immigrate, since it's normally since it's normally defined within a particular cultural context and a web of relations to a place, community, history, religious experience, language, ecology, etc. Eventually, immigrants have to reconstruct a new identity in the new cultural context that's very different from the one they grew up with, same as they have to reconstruct their culture as religious heritage and experience. These processes are inevitable and they normally take a long time with no predictable trajectory or guarantee of success. This process gets even more complicated among communities where the influx of new immigrants from the motherland is still ongoing, which creates multiple generations of immigrants in the same community who are at different stages of cultural self-understanding and adjustment. In all our Levantine communities, there are tensions between the generations from the different waves of immigration. All what I said in this paragraph on identity is not really specific to Levantine communities. It applies to any immigrant group. However, in our communities, this is a very present reality because one is it's a relatively recent immigration. Two, these layers of people are in that parishes. They create a pastoral reality and a cultural reality, and that's very difficult to negotiate within the same community. So what are only some of the elements that constitute the identity of Levantine Christian communities in North America today? One is, the important one, is the liturgical family, because these churches, they are both ethnic and at the same time come from distinct, historically speaking, liturgical families. They use different languages in the liturgies. Armenians use Armenian, the Byzantines use a mix of Arabic, Greek, and here it becomes Arabic, Greek, and English. The Maronites use Syriac and Arabic, and so on and so forth. So, and the Chaldeans also use Syriac. So this has become an important, the belonging to a liturgical family, which is also a rite. That means it has a longer history and distinct spirituality. It makes reference to different saints, to different places of pilgrimage, different origins. So all this gives the people a shared identity within the liturgical family that's very important for their own spirituality and for their own religious self-understanding. Besides the liturgical families comes the linguistic families. So in many of these communities, also there is a distinct language that they speak, but some do more than others. You know, this has been since the emergence of Islam in the region. Arabic became the dominant language, and we're talking now, 1400 years ago. And Arabic has become the language of all these churches, even though many, and in some instances, people could speak Syriac, or Armenians, of course, keep their language because this is a different history of the Armenian churches, but they are a fully integrated part among this group of churches. Added to this linguistic difference, there's also the missionary schools and Western European education. Many Levantine Catholics in particular feel connected to Western European culture, or at least they think they are connected or part of, primarily because of the missionary schools and influence during the colonial period. So most Levantine Christians would speak French fluently because of the strong presence of the French missionaries and schools from the beginning of the 19th century. And the American Protestants and evangelical churches also opened schools starting in the middle of the 19th century and universities. And these two became important cultural influences on these people and connected them to different cultural worlds. So this identity is also present in the communities linguistically, being bilingual, associating to a culture, even though it's a colonial culture, but still, and not consciously thinking of this as some kind of a colonization of a mind or religious practice, but in a way it has become integrated as part of their cultural identity and educational association. So we have one people and one church with multiple languages, multiple liturgical families, but also there are different senses of nationalities, because the whole region, only in the 20th century, starting from the beginning of the 20th century, was divided into nation states. Before 1920, there was no Lebanon, there was no Syria, there was no Palestine. Israel, I don't know, until between 1920 and 1950 of the last century. So all these peoples who migrated, intermixed, part of the same church and family, became citizens of different nation states. And in many ways, these nation states have entered into some kind of tension as a result of, that's how nation states are manipulated in power games in the region, being a very hot and contested region in many ways. So nation states became implicated in these different conflicts. And this put people from the same churches and the same history and the same faith in confrontation with each other when one country occupies another country or enters into war. So this is a reality also that's present inside the communities. Father Pierre was saying this morning, his Maronite parish has people from Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan, primarily Lebanese, because the Maronites are mostly Lebanese. However, you have these different nationalities, even though the nation states were imposed, but they shaped the identity, and at the same time have been assimilated. So they are a fact now for these people. In addition to feeling the sense of communion with the others, you feel the sense of separation because of belonging to different nation states. In addition to this, there are also nationalisms inside the communities, not necessarily along the lines of the nation states, but along the lines of ethnicity. For example, from the beginning of the 20th century, especially among the small groups who had a strong identification as an ethnic group, like the Maronites, until now there is a strong current of Maronite nationalism, the sense of wanting to be a separate people with its own cultural identity and capacity to make decision autonomy in some ways. And this is a strong tendency. Some people try to trace their connections to emphasize the sense of nationalism and identity, using religion, try to trace their connection to Phoenicians or in Copts to the pharaohs or to ancients, to create this kind of distinct ethnic nationality that has long historical roots to distinguish themselves from others. On the other hand, from the middle of the 20th century, in many of these communities, there has been an emergence of Arab nationalism, where many Christians have become important protagonists of nationalism, to think of a pan-Arab political and cultural identity because of language and politics. And so in the communities, you have also many Christians who are Arab nationalists. Now, this has not as strong the sense as it was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s because of fragmentation of the Arab world and somehow demise of this Arab nationalism movement. However, it was strong at one point and still exists. So very briefly, to say a few points about the intersection of many of these identities. So on the one hand, these Catholic communities are in the West as Catholic communities, but they are not really fully Catholic, because Catholics here are mostly Roman Catholic. The connection with these communities is neither the liturgy nor the history. It's mostly an artificial communion that became real over time, that happened in a colonial context in the 18th and 19th centuries. So Catholic, but not fully Catholic, and Middle Eastern, but not Muslim, because for most people in the West who think of people coming from the Middle East, the first impression is that they must be Muslim. So these people are Arab and speak Arabic language and share a culture with Islam, but they are Christian and they are Catholic, and yet have this double sense of belonging to two religions that in the last at least decade have been in some form of a clash that they have. So these Arab Christians are at the intersection of this clash between the religions and civilizations. So that they are Western, but not really Western, because of the colonial impact, educated in Western schools, connecting with Europe, traveling, studying, learning foreign European languages, so develops a sense of association with, which I would say, the double consciousness, or the false consciousness of being a European. However, it's real for people. And this Western, but not really Western. So Arab, but not really Arab, because as an Arab means being Arab has been associated with being Muslim, both for Islam and for the West. While here, being Arab it's my identity as an Arab, Middle Eastern Christian, Levantine. So how do you be both an Arab and a Christian and Catholic and was at the same time, while these identities are in some kind of tension. And in addition to this, while, for example, to take the context in the United States over the last 10, 12 years since 2001, we have the problem of the racialization of Arab Americans, which wasn't really a category before that time as distinct. Arab Americans were white people blended with the white Christian communities, emphasized their Catholicism or Orthodoxy because they wanted to integrate. And now there was forced to separation as Arab Americans as a result of the new context in the US of racializing Arab Americans. So again, Arab or Middle Eastern Levantine Christians stand at this kind of intersection. So how do, one last point of this intersection, I mean there are a lot more, but I will conclude with this part, is being here and there at the same time. And this is also typical of new migrating communities. The ethnic feeling is stronger among newer immigrants who think of themselves as part of the homeland ethnic communities being in diaspora, which means dispersed, hoping to go back to the motherland, and that these people come because of the traditional society and their connection to their homeland. At least the first years of immigration, they still think of a temporary migration, hoping to return one day when the situation gets better. But of course, most people stay because of the situation is conflict and uncertainty is prolonged. So who are we really in the midst of these ambiguities, and how to construct a new identity or think about identity in this context? That's not an easy answer, and I think parishes where people meet and all these feelings and senses of identity intersect is a place where the negotiation takes place, you know. So again, whether churches actually help or are not helpful in this sense, this is a big discussion, but I don't dare to be very critical because Father Pierre, the chair of our panel, might not like what I'm going to say. So I'll save this for a private conversation later. One last point, which for me is crucial, that I've become aware of more recently, which is the healing and reconciliation in the communities. Most of our people are migrants as a result of war and conflict. So there is a trauma. We are traumatized communities. Many people experienced war directly, lost family members, lost their homes and possessions, had a family back home that experienced violence. And the fact that this violence is ongoing, so if it's only, let's say for me as a Lebanese who lived 15 years of very hard war in the country, named as a so-called civil war from 75 to 90. So if it's a historical period and one is living in a society, you can process this and somehow make sense of it and come to terms and move on. But because the traumas, I mean, the reminder of the traumas is ongoing. Like I relive again and again the Lebanese war trauma, which I experienced myself during the multiple invasions of Lebanon after the war ended in 1990 by our neighbor to the south, the state of Israel, or by our neighbor to the north, Syria, which is a country of the same culture, but also occupied Lebanon for a while. And the 2006 war on Lebanon was a destructive month. I was in Chicago at that time. The country was totally destroyed. So the thing is, you relive these traumas again and again because you're not taking a distance from what happened. And then now we relive the trauma again with what's happening in Syria, because this is now 3 years of war. It's the same people with all the connections. So people are not having the opportunity to actually move out of this nightmare of violence and war and destruction to get to a point where they can rebuild a new identity and move on to healing and reconciliation. Now, and of course, I cannot forget the ongoing trauma of the Palestinian people, and that's another important aspect because they are fully integrated part of the Levantine Christian communities, and this is a very painful reality. The constant invasions land takeover and house demolitions and imprisonment and torture all over the region. So this makes it really very complex. Unfortunately, this is a topic that's very much is a taboo in our communities. We don't really talk about it. People want to forget and move on, but I think this is a fundamental reality that shapes our communities in diaspora. This deep feeling of being of trauma, and there is very little pastoral attention to this area. First, in terms of understanding and acknowledging this, too, is to be prepared to how do you deal and how our traditions and spirituality can actually be reinterpreted or contributed, and along the same lines that Margarita was talking about, as a resource for dealing with this trauma. So this is a big, dark area in our pastoral experience in diaspora, which I think needs a very urgent pastoral attention and pastoral work. So I want to really quickly over this topic, but I think this is a topic that we need to research more and spend more time talking about internally in our communities as part of our culture now. And so I want to conclude by just two thoughts about the future. I think that we need to develop a ministry of healing and reconciliation in the parishes and the dioceses, given the magnitude of the experience of trauma and the need for healing. Churches can play a significant role that no one else can because of who they are, and of all the rituals that we have and the spirituality. But first, we need to be aware of the need and to be prepared. The second point is we need to cultivate a new identity as Levantine Christian communities for building solidarity among the different communities and not be isolated in the small ethnic communities, being it a liturgical family or a nationalism, but to cross communities lines and think of a Levantine people to think about churches in service of these people and their communities. Collaboration between parishes and dioceses of the same churches in the same cities. It's rare that dioceses or parishes collaborate across these lines I mentioned, so that's a major weakness for our communities. And a new theology of Islam and mission that's actually emerging in the Middle East among the churches. They are rethinking their identity in relation to Islam and thinking more about the common culture and laying down this whole notion of evangelizing Islam that was strongly present from the 18th and 19th centuries to a more sense of mission with Islam rather than to Islam, and creating a sense of a Middle Eastern people of faith witnessing together to God's to God's love and mercy and building societies, just societies together. So this necessity for collaboration within the communities, reaching out to Islam with whom we share a culture and are the same people in the West. We really have closer cultural ties and sometimes religious experience more with Islam than with the Catholic communities where we find ourselves as a Western Catholic communities. So, and again, to contribute to peace and reconciliation in the Middle East, both through working with our governments here, as well as with organizations and advocacy movements, try to support, because I think this also contributes to the question of healing. So this is really a very broad overview there's a lot that needs to be said by way of context to help make sense of the pastoral and the cultural comments, but that's all I can do in half an hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Michel. We still have now 10 minutes for questions. If someone have a question, please use the microphone, and let it be only a question, no comments, no explanation, no stories, just to save time and to allow everybody to say what they have to say. Thank you.
Well, my question is to Professor Mooney on the key concept of suffering is transformative. Transformative of what? What is the content? And transformative into what? Don't you see, I think perhaps there's a tendency to push the argument further that you tend to glorify suffering? How does it sort of, how does it help the central questions into which people face in their daily life, that suffering? How does it transform their daily lives in their everyday lives?
Is this on? Yes, okay. Well, I think that the suffering is transforming the person's own concept of themselves, and it's an opening of the person to a greater ability to connect with other people, as they told me. And the suffering also, it transforms the community and makes the community bonds be on something that is not simply a utilitarian basis, right? That it's on kind of connecting amongst people. So is this glorifying suffering? I don't think so. I think that I'm sort of addressing this from an American context, which has a very strong utilitarian view of suffering as something that has to be eliminated, and nothing good can ever come from it. So this is kind of the narrative that I'm challenging. In the context of Haiti itself, and I'll just be very brief, the context of Haiti itself and also in these communities, the transforming of suffering, influencing personal identity, and creating social bonds is not the only end in these communities. They are actively engaging with the social and political conditions that cause this suffering, but not from a perspective that we will reach a perfect society in this world. So I find this is an important point to make to the people that I'm usually speaking with, who have an enlightenment mentality that we can get our political and social structures perfected such that suffering will be gone.
Other questions?
I have a question for both of the speakers. I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you see happening in the next generations, the second and third generations in the Haitian community and the Levantine communities. There seems to be a sort of narrative that inevitably America is the melting pot and people will just assimilate. But there's been some people doing work on, especially the Mexican community, and showing that Mexicans have not just sort of blended in the same way that previous immigrant groups have, and I'm wondering if there's possibilities in the Levantine and the Haitian communities that something else besides just the melting pot might happen.
In terms of the Levantine community, one of the main complaints from the parish perspectives, on the Christian context, is that the first generation stopped coming to church for the most part because of the ongoing immigration. So the church is catering primarily to the new immigrants. It becomes a center for social life, for connecting them with the community, for finding work, for the initial stage. But then because of the incapacity of the parish to serve the multiple generations, so one group stops coming, and this is a main complaint of pastors I've talked to all over North America. So one of the issues is that the first generation gets integrated and become Canadian or American. They melt to a certain extent, but it's hard to tell what's going to happen to the since it's not clearly one generation and the second generation, so there's an ongoing overlapping of connections within the community of these generations. So it's more complex to actually detect what the adaptation process or the integration or assimilation depends on what. And since the relationship with the region and the questions of racialization I talked about also are a new phenomenon, so it's not happening in a neutral field where a natural process is just taking its course, where you come, you find work, you learn the language, you're a new generation. There is this kind of complex connection with the ethnic community and its reinvention of identity in the community based on the racializations and tensions makes this really difficult process.
Yeah, I would say. Okay. I didn't get into a lot of detail, but I actually spent time with the Haitian communities in Miami, but also in Montreal and Paris. So I think one thing to point out is that the United States really is the country in which immigrants are allowed, even encouraged, to maintain an ethnic identity. This is most definitely not the case in France. In fact, I would like to hear about Lebanese Melkites in France, one more layer of identity, which must be part of who they are. Yet I have a hard time imagining that Lebanese in France are really French, but yet they are, but yet they're not. And this must be a very interesting comparison to look at Lebanese, or really to look at French-speaking migrants from the former French colonies who go back to France. It's a huge source of conflict. So with regards to the second generation Haitians, let's say, in France, they are French citizens, and as far as kind of French politics goes, that's it. But on the ground, that's not it, right? So there's this huge disjuncture between sort of the political discourse that immigrants in France, the goal is to make them French citizens, and as soon as they have political belonging, everything else is secondary to that. But this is not how people live their lives, which I think we heard yesterday. People live their lives as moral beings. They have multiple layers of identity. But in France, there's only one identity. It's the citizen. So I would say, in contrast here in the United States, Haitians in Miami have really built a very strong ethnic, religious community that I think allows Haitians to be Haitians, but also to be Americans, and I think their goal is to help them, and this is what the priests would tell me, to pick the best of both cultures. And I think with regards to the second generation, I think that priests as well as lay leaders need to work with the second generation to pick out the best of those cultures. The second generation struggles to challenge some of their parents' ideas about authority or about what professions are acceptable. And on the other hand, the second generation needs to learn to listen to their parents about something. So I think there's tremendous identity struggles going on with the second generation, in particular for groups like Haitians who are so marginalized from the mainstream society in many ways and are trying so hard to fit in. And their parents are just coming from a very different background where they've sacrificed so much. So I'm not sure if that exactly answers your question.
Thank you, Professor. With that, we conclude our session. We'd like to thank the DePaul University for accommodating this wonderful sharing of thoughts and knowledge. Thanks for all of you for coming. Thanks for our professors, for the organizers, and may God bless you, and we continue working toward this peace and justice in our societies. Thank you.